and welcome to the Pennsylvania Soldiers and Sailors Home. I'm Barb Raymond, the Commandant here at the facility. As the oldest state veterans home in the Commonwealth, we have a rich history and a proud tradition of caring for Pennsylvania's servicemen and women. Throughout its time here, the home has seen many changes, but from the beginning, our goal has always been to maintain the highest quality of care for our residents. As we enter our 132nd year of operation, I am excited to introduce you to our history, Erie's history, and your history. Welcome.
The ground on which the Soldiers and Sailors Home resides is a tract of land in Erie that is intertwined with rich history, dating back thousands of years with the Native Americans who lived in this area, followed by the French, who actually were the first European settlers in this area, and then the British, and ultimately the Americans in 1795.
This land was riddled with conflict, making it rather fitting that it should eventually be converted to a residence for veterans of war. The most notable veteran to make his mark here was General Anthony Wayne, a Revolutionary War hero and later renowned Native American fighter. He passed through the American fortifications here, known as Garrison Hill, after signing the Treaty of Greenville with Native Americans in Ohio Territory in 1795.
He was suffering very, very poorly with gout. He was losing weight, and it was pretty much apparent to Wayne that his life was soon to end. This contrasted sharply to a man who felt that the most honorable way to die was in battle. That was not the case with Anthony Wayne. On December 15th, 1796, in the East Blockhouse, closest to Garrison Run, Anthony Wayne, the great American hero, died.
Local legend surrounds Wayne's death. It is said that when Wayne's son Isaac came to collect his father's remains about a decade later, the body was perfectly preserved except for one leg. Dr. John Wallace, who accompanied Isaac to exhume the body, boiled Wayne in a kettle until the bones were stripped of flesh and packed them up to travel back to Wayne's hometown of Radnor, Pennsylvania, near Philadelphia. Wallace buried what was left of him back into the grave at the foot of the flagpole. The blockhouse that Wayne is now buried under was rebuilt at its current location in 1879, as the original blockhouse he died in burned in 1853. That blockhouse was part of the American fort located on site, which Commodore Perry used in the War of 1812 to defend Erie against the British. After this conflict, however, the area was left unused until about 50 years later, when Erieites began to reconsider its purpose within the community.
It was actually built in 1867, 1868 by an act of legislation put forth by Marl Lowry, who was from Erie, Pennsylvania. The act of legislation allowed the Marine Association to incorporate what we know then as the military ground. This was 100 acres of ground that was set aside specifically for the U.S. military. Lowry decided that it would be in its best interest if they were to build a Marine hospital to take care of the soldiers that actually worked and fought on the Great Lakes. But unusual, it did not develop. Even though they acquired $90,000 from the state, additional funding came from this local region. The facility actually sat fallow for about 20 years. It wasn't until 1885 that Morrow Lowry, as well as a representative from Corey by the name of Brown, actually again went to the state to pass legislation to create, at that time, a soldiers and sailors home for those who fought in the Civil War, in particular, a place where they would be taken care of and their families.
The building underwent several renovations and opened to the public on February 22nd of the following year with a grand dedication. The governor gave an address, and the city of Erie turned out in droves to witness a procession honoring the home's establishment and those whom it was designed to serve. 27 applications were immediately accepted, allowing veterans with a variety of ailments to seek shelter and receive care at the new facility, led by William Webster Tyson, a Civil War veteran himself. Until 1976, commandants following Tyson would report to a board of trustees who officially managed the facility. This home stood as a model for Ohio's Veterans Home in Sandusky and followed New Jersey in a pattern of states opening homes for veterans. It was highly popular in the early years. Its news stories were featured in the New York Times, and its residents were revered with grand Memorial Day festivities. The building sat on 107 acres originally and included a two-story infirmary or hospital where the sickest of residents could be treated by a doctor. There was a chapel, which could seat 600 and was used primarily for entertainment events as well as weekly services. The home was self-sufficient in its early days and included a barn for livestock and a garden for fresh produce. Recreation on the lake was only about a football field's length away, as there was a boathouse located on the shore to launch fishing trips and provide other leisurely excursions. There were rooms, dormitory style, on each of the 3 floors and could house several men at the time. The general interior resembled, it was said, a hotel, with a massive dining room that could seat up to 500, with high ceilings and containing around 40 bird cages with canaries in them. Residents of the home were subject to strict discipline, like their military service. The men were roused by a bugle call at 6 a.m. most mornings and were expected to attend breakfast at 7 if they wished to eat that morning. Their attire was given to them by the home, a uniform resembling one that they had been outfitted with when they served. One man, George Wilhelmy, recorded in his diary his reaction to this aspect of the home.
It did make me feel odd to behold myself once more clad in the uniform of Uncle Sam after a lapse of 30 years.
Alcohol was forbidden, perceived to be a detriment to the veterans who would surely succumb to its effects. There seemed to be a fear in the early years of drunkenness among men, originally called inmates. It was the only punishable crime which faced the men, and consequently, a popular one for them to violate. Rowdy residents caused scenes and were forced to be detained in the home's basement, where lie several jail cells to contain the gentleman until he was sobered up and or dishonorably discharged from the home. The men were expected to earn their keep, if they could, and thus were employed in a variety of odd jobs around the home. They would receive a meager monthly salary in addition to their pension of $3. Not all residents were able to reintegrate back into society. The condition and age of many of those admitted prevented them from attaining this goal. Men came into the home with diseases such as paralysis of the heart, rheumatism, and softening of the brain. In the 1890s, the death rate per week was about 3 or 4 residents. Wilhelmy noted this in his diary.
Persons not familiar with the circumstances would naturally think that the death rate among the inmates of this home was exceedingly great. But when it is considered that nearly 400 old men are huddled together, none of whom is less than 50 years of age, and nearly every one of them has brought an ailment of some description, this is not in excess.
Tyson resigned at the start of the 20th century after a 13-year term, bringing in a new line of leadership that could not compete with his patience and dedication. R.S. Cullum, who was his immediate predecessor and who eventually stepped down due to mental health reasons, provided in the 1902 trustee report detailed information on the residents' 15 years into the operations. New medical facilities had been adopted by this time. The men's behavior was much improved from the early drunken rampages seen by some, and religious services were well attended weekly. In 1902, there were 482 residents, many with a disability or illness, and 268 bodies in the home cemetery. 1904 saw a packed 569 residents within the building. Today, the population stands at roughly 200, and the graves of almost 1,400 servicemen lie in the cemetery behind the home. The press was still positively invested in the men of the home now. Stories of the residents like Thomas N. Stewart made newspapers like the Erie Sunday Morning Post, allowing him and others to tell their war stories to a wider audience than their table mates at supper time.
I remained about 1 year participating in the Battle of Fort Fisher, after which I was transferred to the Powhatan and sailed for Cuba and the Brazils, up the Straits of Magellan. We stopped at Patagonia, where we traded with the Indians, and from there to the coaling station, and then to Valparaiso, and took in the war between the Spain and Peru. We were finally discharged October 27th.
Other than writing, some of the men spent their free time down by the boathouse, as the home still owned property up to the lake. Despite a few issues over pension money, the early 20th century at the Pennsylvania Soldiers and Sailors Home saw little disruptions. Its staff was especially dedicated.
My grandfather, his name was Joe Koenig. He started work here in 1905 at the age of 15, and he worked here for 52 years in the kitchen, retiring in 1957, and he ended up being the kitchen manager.
As the world became engaged with the First Great War, Erie's home for veterans grappled with Mother Nature. The farm was flooded in 1915 with some damage done to the livestock, and the pollution of Lake Erie began to reach the home, which at that time was located on the bayfront. The home's chapel went up in flames, though was not destroyed. The Board of Trustees led renovations by installing the famous Lincoln stained glass window, said to be made of Tiffany glass, in 1914. 2 years later, a depiction of the Monitor and Merrimack Civil War Ironsides battle was placed beneath Lincoln's likeness. Their placement greatly pleased residents, all of whom at this time were Civil War veterans who had once fought for the Union. Throughout the Roaring Twenties, things remained stable at the home. Audits conducted during the decade called the home highly commendable, and the largest problem was a rat infestation in the pig pens because of their close proximity to the sewers. The best stories from this time about the residents come from May MacDonald, the Commandant's secretary from 1927 until 1958. It took her some time to get comfortable in her position, as several of the men thought her too damn young, but she came to greatly enjoy the time spent at the home.
When I started to work at the home, the membership was made up of practically all veterans of the Civil War. If I were to say that they were overjoyed with my presence, I would be telling an untruth. I was eyed quite suspiciously, and nary a one said, "I am pleased to meet you." If I ever felt unimportant, it was my first day at the Soldiers' Home. However, as the days and weeks went by, they became my friends, and my desk soon became a fruit basket. Some so black, I often wondered how long they had been in their possession.
The start of the Great Depression also brought about a sad time at the home. Several prominent figures passed away, including Commandant Allen McLean and some long-term residents. There wasn't just death, however. There was also new life. The groundskeeper of the home, Charles Smith, lived on the property, and his wife, Charlotte, gave birth to 2 children while her husband was working at the site. Charles and Charlene grew up watching their father tend to the grounds and a literally blossoming conservatory.
My dad was ground superintendent and run the greenhouse, which a good many people in Erie probably still remember. My sister Charlene was also born here in 1932, and we were the only 2 children ever born right here on the grounds and lived here.
As the Second World War began to drag the United States into combat, the home continued to exude patriotism and dedication towards its honorable residents. The workforce boasted hard-working employees whose tireless efforts to improve life on the grounds were apparent. The men of the home were satisfied, and new blood continued to choose PSSH as a place to call home. The first World War II vet to be admitted was 27-year-old Ed Lauer in 1943. While the home has a long and celebrated history, it faced a unique set of challenges for a number of years in which its existence remained in question. These dark times began roughly in the years after World War II, although as early as 1944 there was talk of closing the home in this instance, to its original use as a military hospital. Maybe one of the first indications there is to the start of this period in the home's history is the discovery of 5 neglected graves in the cemetery, covered almost completely by foliage. This would be a symbol of the next few decades to come at the Pennsylvania Soldiers and Sailors Home. Proper care and monetary funds were not allocated to the home, and despite numerous changes in the leadership of the home and multiple official inspections, threats to close it continued to rise up. Despite the negative press and unsatisfactory conditions, however, the home persevered with the help of locals who fought to keep it alive. Residents spoke out in support of their home, hoping desperately that someone might take their opinions into account. Commandants like Arthur Bud Jackson worked to improve PSSH so that the indigent, invalid, or disabled veterans who lived there could be given a better life than they would have had otherwise. Throughout this dark period of neglect, there were signs that pointed towards its eventual end. With the passing of House Bill 1207 in 1979, the home was signed $1.4 million to renovate and repair the facility. This spurred a period of renewal that would change the situation of the home and its residents for the better. With the installment of the $2.7 million nursing care unit to the facility, which demonstrated investment, time, and resources being focused on the Pennsylvania Soldiers and Sailors Home, things started to look up. At this point, the total capacity for residents sat at 175. A new commandant, Stanley Snyder, took office in 1982 and dedicated himself to preserving the home's mission by acknowledging its past. His administration was in office during the home's centennial, and things like the return and installation of an original Civil War cannon, which had once rested on the grounds, instilled within the men a measure of pride, which they had not had in quite some time. Snyder's term in office brought about a great deal of welcome, much-needed change, including the first female resident in 1986. It was then that the patriotic, reverential spirit began to return.
In the late 1980s, I was teaching at Erie East High School, and the students had an opportunity to be published in the Erie newspaper. So we decided to contact the Pennsylvania Soldiers and Sailors Home and see if we could interview some of the veterans, but to make it a more deeper experience, that the students wanted to also volunteer here.
Other projects were started at Snyder's behest to beautify and improve the home, and to make it more appealing to the community. The cemetery, for example, was reorganized to place the interred in more orderly rows. Government money was further allocated to more properly restore it. Things had definitely improved, and as the second millennium ended, the home certainly had much to celebrate. The strong leadership of Becky Park, second female commandant in the home's history, propelled PSSH into the next century. It was during her term of leadership that the Dementia Alzheimer's Unit was opened, making the total capacity of the home 207 and allowing it to stay true to its mission of caring for all of Pennsylvania's servicemen and women to the best of its ability. The residents themselves continued to enjoy a variety of activities put on by the staff. Publications like the Blockhouse Briefs advertised to them and the Erie community just what was going on inside the old brick walls. Today, the home is still thriving. More than a century later, it continues to serve those who have served our country, carrying on a proud tradition of veterans care.
I feel very fortunate in that my position allows me to connect great people to our veterans at the home, helping them improve their quality of life. I've always been overwhelmed by the amount of support that the Erie community provides to the Soldiers and Sailors Home.
What led me into the field of activities was just the desire to make people's lives better. Here at the Soldiers and Sailors Home, I get to do that on a daily basis to some of the greatest heroes that we'll ever know. They don't come here because they have no lives. They come here to live.
Some of them have family. We even build relationships with the families, but just sometimes they have no families, and we are family to them.
Being the son of an Army veteran, it's a good feeling to know that we're taking care of these veterans and their spouses. We're adding good days to the last years of their life. Be around the veterans, to show them your respect for what they did for this country, those who served and those who are still serving.
In my 7 years as Commandant here at the Soldiers and Sailors Home, we've undergone a lot of changes, a lot of physical changes here at the building, with improvements in safety and security. We have such a rich history. I'm so proud to be here.
Even though the institution has stood for over 100 years, the people at the Pennsylvania Soldiers and Sailors Home have always provided its foundation. Residents, families, employees, and volunteers are the reason it has withstood the test of time and will continue to be the reason it succeeds.
My mother, Leona Fisher, lived in her own home for 60 years, including 6 years after my father passed. When it became evident that she needed to move to an assisted living facility, the only place she would consider was the Pennsylvania Soldiers and Sailors Home.
He had Parkinson's disease, and he also had glaucoma, and he was legally blind from the glaucoma and had a leader dog. He had gone through the VA for training to have this leader dog whose name was Amos, and as my dad always said, Amos was famous. He was well cared for, and we as a family, we have good memories of coming here to be with him.
Pretty much satisfied with what's going on here. I let people know just what I think about it, you know.
It's just like home. Every day, everybody that works here at the home is just fantastic. You couldn't ask for better staff.
Every time I came in the older building, in through the front door, I was always impressed with the beautiful display cabinet that sits right there in the lobby. The artifacts themselves were deteriorating terribly, and I always felt something needed to be done. A kernel of an idea started growing that something had to be done to that cabinet, and maybe I was the one to do it. As people enter, that cabinet now sets the tone for the respectful care that all the residents receive at the Pennsylvania Soldiers and Sailors Home.
I remember when my husband and I were dating back in the 60s, we used to come down here and ride around the grounds. But I remember telling him one time, someday I'm going to work here. And I did. It took a lot of years to get here. It was a great time. But I love this place, and I talk it up everywhere I go. I just think it's a great place, and we are so fortunate to have this in the city of Erie.